Thousands are standing in the heat of Bani Walid on this February 6th, 2026, but the air is cold with suspicion. The burial of Saif Al-Islam Gaddafi was supposed to be a quiet closing of a chapter, a final silence for a family that once challenged the world. Instead, it has become a roar that is shaking the foundations of the Sahel. This massive gathering follows the dark events of February 3rd, 2026, when the heir to the Gaddafi legacy was silenced by gunfire in his own home in Zintan. Ibrahim Traoré, the leader who speaks what others fear to whisper, has raised a chilling question that the global media is trying to ignore. Was this really a natural end, or was it a tactical assassination disguised as chaos to ensure that the ghost of the old order never rises again? To my brothers and sisters of the African diaspora, I ask you to look closely at these images of mourning. Do you feel the weight of this moment in your soul? This is not just news from a distant land. It is a mirror reflecting our shared struggle for justice and truth. For too long, our leaders have disappeared in the shadows whenever they dare to dream of a self-reliant continent. Ibrahim Traoré recently said, "When the lion's cub begins to grow his mane, the hunters do not wait for him to roar. They strike in the silence of the night to protect their own cages." These words pierce through the official narratives like a spear. This is a moment of profound sadness for Africa, but it is also a moment of clarity. Burkina Faso and the brave vision of Ibrahim Traoré stand at the heart of this new awakening, reminding us that the freedom of Africa is the only path to our collective dignity. This is a collision between a rising continent and an old superpower. Why is Washington watching these crowds with such anxiety? Does the shadow of Saif Gaddafi still threaten the supremacy of the US dollar and the financial chains that hold us back? We are going to uncover the truth that the mainstream media is too afraid to touch. Before we dive into the evidence, hit that like button and subscribe to stand with the truth. And tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching the rise of a new Africa? Let the world see that our spirit has no borders. The world was told that on February 3rd, 2026, a man died of a sudden illness in the mountains of Zintan. But in the markets of Ouagadougou and the streets of Bamako, nobody believes the official report. Ibrahim Traoré certainly does not. When you look at the life of Saif Al-Islam Gaddafi, you see a man who was not just a son of a fallen leader, but a living bridge to an era of African independence that certain powers wanted to bury forever. To understand why Traoré is questioning this final breath, we have to look at the timing. Why now? Why, just as Libya was finally whispering about a unified election that might actually put an African nationalist back in power, did his heart suddenly stop? In the world of high-stakes geopolitics, there are no coincidences, only coordinated outcomes. For the last decade, Saif was the silent variable in the Libyan equation. He was the one person who could unite the tribes of the East with the cities of the West, because he carried the name of the man who built the great man-made river. When he was taken out on that Tuesday in early February, it was not just a man who died, it was a potential future for a sovereign Libya that died with him. Traoré knows this because he has seen the script before. He has seen how the brightest lights in Africa are often dimmed just before they can lead the way out of the darkness. Let us talk about the medical report for a moment. The local authorities spoke of a cardiac event. But where was the international oversight? Where was the transparency? When a figure as significant as the heir to the Gaddafi legacy passes away, the lack of a neutral, independent autopsy is a loud, screaming alarm. Ibrahim Traoré has pointed out that the silence from Western capitals regarding the details of this death is deafening. Usually, when a high-profile political figure dies under strange circumstances, there are calls for investigations. But here, there was only a quiet nod of relief from the halls of power in Washington and Paris. This is what Traoré calls the diplomacy of convenience. If the death serves your interests, you do not ask questions. This brings us to a concept we must all understand, the doctrine of strategic removal. Throughout history, when a nation or a continent begins to find its footing, the most effective way to cause a collapse is not through a massive invasion, but through the removal of the symbolic head. We saw it with Patrice Lumumba. We saw it with Thomas Sankara. And Traore is suggesting we might have just witnessed it again with Saif Al-Islam. The goal is to create a vacuum. When there is no clear leader for the people to rally behind, they fall back into infighting. They become distracted by their own pain, and while they are fighting each other, the resources of the land continue to flow out to the same old buyers at the same old prices. Think about the person who benefits most from this void. It is not the Libyan people who are now left without a unifying voice. It is the foreign corporations and the central banks that fear a return to the policies of the 1970s and 80s, when Africa demanded a fair price for its oil and gold. Saif al-Islam was a student of his father's vision for a unified African currency. He understood that as long as Africa trades its wealth in a currency it does not control, it will never be truly free. By questioning the nature of his death, Traore is reminding us that we are still in a state of war, even if the bombs are not falling on our houses every day. It is a war of shadows, a war of information, and a war of legitimacy. The funeral on February 6th, 2026 was not just a ceremony of grief, it was a gathering of witnesses. Those thousands of people who walked through the dust to reach Bani Walid were not there because they were told to be. They were there because they felt the same suspicion that Ibrahim Traoré felt. They saw the bruises on the soul of their nation, and they knew that another piece of their sovereignty had been snatched away in the middle of the night. Traoré's warning to the West is simple. You can kill a man, but you cannot kill the memory of what he represented. If this was an assassination, it was a clumsy one, because it has only turned a survivor into a martyr, and martyrs are far more dangerous to an empire than living politicians ever could be. We must ask ourselves what this means for the rest of the continent. If the son of a king is not safe in his own home, who among us is? This is the fear that the planners of this event wanted to spread. They wanted every African leader who dreams of independence to look at Zintan and feel a chill in their spine, but they miscalculated the spirit of the new Africa. Instead of fear, Traoré is responding with defiance. Instead of retreating, he is using this tragedy to teach us a lesson about vigilance. He is showing us that our unity is our only true shield. Without it, we are just individual targets waiting for our turn in the silence. As we look closer at the evidence that is slowly leaking out from the mountains of Libya, the inconsistencies only grow. There are reports of movements by private military contractors in the area just hours before the event. There are whispers of a digital blackout that hit the region at the exact moment the incident occurred. These are the technical footprints of a professional operation, not a natural tragedy. Ibrahim Traoré is urging us to stop being naive. We are living in a time where the truth is often buried deeper than the people we love. But the truth has a way of rising, and when it does, it will bring with it a storm that no superpower can contain. To understand why Ibrahim Traoré is so concerned about the events of February 2026, we have to travel back in time to the year 2011. The mainstream media told you that the intervention in Libya was about protecting civilians and bringing democracy to a desert nation. But those who follow the money know a different story. Ibrahim Traoré has often spoken about the hidden chains of debt and currency that keep Africa in a state of permanent struggle. When we look at the legacy of the Gaddafi family, we are not just looking at a political dynasty. We are looking at the architects of the most significant threat to the global financial system in the last 50 years. This is the educational truth that many Western textbooks will never mention. Before the fall of Tripoli, Libya was a nation with zero external debt. Think about that for a moment. In a world where every major superpower is drowning in trillions of dollars of debt, Libya was truly sovereign because it owed nothing to the international banking cartels. But Muammar Gaddafi had a plan that went even further. He wanted to create a Pan-African currency backed by gold. He called it the gold dinar. The goal was simple but revolutionary: to stop selling African oil for US dollars and start selling it for African gold. If this plan had succeeded, the economic map of the world would have shifted overnight. The US dollar, which derives its value from being the world's primary reserve currency for energy, would have faced a catastrophic decline in demand. Ibrahim Traoré understands this better than anyone. He knows that when you challenge the dollar, you are not just challenging a currency, you are challenging a global military and political architecture. Saif Al-Islam Gaddafi was the keeper of this dangerous knowledge. He was not just his father's son, he was the one tasked with modernizing this vision and making it palatable to a new generation of leaders. Even in his years of isolation and captivity, Saif remained a symbol of that unfinished financial revolution. His existence was a constant reminder to the central banks in Washington and London that the dream of a gold-backed African currency was not dead. It was merely waiting for the right moment to return. Let us be very honest about the mechanics of the petrodollar system. For decades, the United States has maintained its standard of living by ensuring that oil must be bought and sold in dollars. This forces every country on Earth to hold massive amounts of U.S. currency, which in turn allows the U.S. to print money and export its inflation to the rest of the world. When a leader like Gaddafi, or a potential leader like Saif, suggests a different way, they are essentially threatening the retirement funds and the economic stability of the entire Western world. This is why Traore is so suspicious of the timing of Saif's death. Just as the Sahel alliance is beginning to discuss its own independent currency to replace the CFA franc, the last major link to the gold dinar project is suddenly removed from the board. Ibrahim Traoré has pointed out that the 2011 intervention did not bring democracy. It brought a vacuum that allowed for the systematic looting of Libya's sovereign wealth. Over 150 tons of gold and billions of dollars in foreign reserves simply vanished. Where did it go? It did not go to the Libyan people who are now struggling to keep their lights on. It was absorbed into the global financial maw by silencing Saif Al-Islam on February 3, 2026. Those same forces are attempting to ensure that no one can ever come forward to claim that wealth or restart the project that would have ended African dependency. This is the strategic map that we must keep in our minds. The events in Libya are not isolated from the events in Burkina Faso or Mali. They are parts of the same struggle for the soul of the continent's resources. Traore's vision for a new Africa is built on the ruins of the old world's broken promises. He sees that the US dollar is currently facing challenges from many sides, including the BRICS nations and internal inflation. In this fragile state, the last thing the current financial order needs is a charismatic Libyan leader who could unite the oil-rich tribes under a banner of financial sovereignty. The ghost of 2011 still haunts the halls of power. Every time Ibrahim Traoré speaks about self-reliance, the echoes of the Gaddafi era can be heard. This is why the education of the youth is so vital. If the next generation understands that their poverty is not a result of a lack of resources, but a result of a rigged financial system, they will become impossible to control. Traoré is using the tragedy of Saif al-Islam to highlight this imbalance. He is telling us that as long as we allow our leaders to be picked off one by one, we will remain a collection of fragments instead of a unified force. The burial of Saif Al-Islam Gaddafi marks the end of a physical lineage. But as Traoré warns, it has only accelerated the intellectual spread of his father's most dangerous idea. The idea that Africa belongs to Africans and its wealth should benefit the people living on its soil. This is a threat to the global status quo that no amount of military force can fully suppress. The US dollar might have survived the threat in 2011 by removing the father, and it may think it has secured its future in 2026 by removing the son. But they have forgotten that in Africa, the soil keeps the memory of the blood that is spilled upon it. When you see the massive crowds in the streets of Libya, you are seeing a people who have realized that the promises of 2011 were a lie. They are looking for a way back to a time when their nation had a voice and their future was not decided in foreign capitals. Ibrahim Traoré is giving voice to that collective realization. He is forcing us to ask the hard questions. Who really benefits from a broken Libya? And why is the truth about the Gaddafi family so terrifying to the most powerful nations on earth? The answer lies in the vaults of the central banks and the price of a barrel of oil. While the leaders in Washington and the analysts in Paris look at maps and satellite images, people like Mama Fatuma look at the empty chairs at their dinner tables. Fatuma is 55 years old, living on the dusty outskirts of a small town in northern Burkina Faso. Her hands are calloused from decades of working the soil, but her eyes carry a weight that no amount of rest can heal. On the morning of February 6, 2026, as the news of Saif Al-Islam Gaddafi's funeral crackled over her small battery-powered radio. She sat in silence. To the world, Saif was a political figure, a son of a fallen leader. A headline, to Fatuma. The name Gaddafi is a painful reminder of the day her world began to crumble. She remembers a time before 2011 when the road to Libya was a path to opportunity. Her eldest son had traveled north back then, finding work in the construction boom that was transforming Tripoli. He sent home money every month, enough to build a sturdy roof and keep his younger siblings in school. Libya was the engine of North Africa, a place where a young man from the Sahel could build a future. But when the bombs started falling on Tripoli in 2011, that engine exploded. Her son never made it home. He disappeared in the chaos that followed the foreign intervention, another unnamed casualty of a war he didn't start. Mama Fatuma's story is not unique. It is the story of millions across the Sahel who have been paying the price for decisions made in air-conditioned rooms thousands of miles away. When the Libyan state was dismantled, the gates of a massive warehouse were kicked open. Weapons, thousands of them, flowed south like a river of fire. These were the guns that eventually found their way into the hands of the groups that now haunt Fatuma's village. This is what Ibrahim Traoré means when he speaks about the consequence chain. You cannot burn down your neighbor's house and expect the smoke not to drift into yours. The instability that killed Saif al-Islam's father and eventually led to the suspicious end of Saif himself on February 3rd, 2026, is the same instability that forced Fatuma to flee her ancestral lands 2 years ago. Later that afternoon, Fatuma's phone rang. It was her nephew calling from Atlanta, Georgia. He is part of our brothers and sisters of the African diaspora, a young man who escaped the poverty of home but carries the burden of his family on his shoulders from across the ocean. He was calling to check on her, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and sorrow. He had seen the videos of the funeral on social media. He asked her, "Auntie, why does the world keep doing this to us? Why do they tell us they are bringing freedom and only leave us with graves?" Fatuma didn't have an answer, but she felt a strange sense of connection. Even in America, her nephew could feel the tremors of the earthquake that started in Libya. This is the reality of the new Africa that Ibrahim Traoré is fighting for. It is an Africa where a woman like Fatuma doesn't have to fear the night. She supports Traoré not because of grand speeches, but because he is the first leader in her lifetime who looks at her pain and calls it by its real name, injustice. He is the one who points out that the death of a man like Saif al-Islam is a signal of more trouble coming for the poor. When the powerful are being silenced in Zintan, the vulnerable are being squeezed in the Sahel. Traoré knows that until Libya is stable and sovereign, Burkina Faso will always be looking over its shoulder. The story of Mama Fatuma is a lesson in the human cost of geopolitics. We often talk about the US dollar, the price of oil, and strategic vacuums, but we must never forget that these things translate into real lives. Every time a sovereign system is broken from the outside, 1,000 families like Fatuma's are broken with it. The suspicion surrounding Saif's death on February 3rd is not just a conspiracy theory for the elite. It is a terrifying omen for the common people. It means the war for Africa's soul is intensifying, and the hunters are getting desperate. As Fatuma turned off her radio, she looked at the horizon. She saw the dust kicked up by the wind and wondered if it was carrying the spirit of a new era or just more of the same old sorrow. But then she remembered the words of Traore, and she felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not the hollow hope of a political campaign, but the stubborn hope of a survivor. She knows that as long as there are leaders who refuse to bow, there is a chance that the next generation will not have to sit by a radio and mourn the loss of their future. This is why we stand with the truth, and why we listen when the silent voices of Africa finally begin to speak. If you look at a map of the world today, you might see borders and names like Libya, Mali, and Burkina Faso as separate entities. But Ibrahim Traoré sees a different reality. He sees a single, interconnected battlefield where the destiny of one nation dictates the survival of the next. To understand why the world is trembling after the events of the February 3rd, 2026, we must look at the strategic map that stretches from the Mediterranean coast of Tripoli all the way down to the heart of the Sahel. This is not just geography, it is a masterclass in the geopolitics of chaos. When the state of Libya was shattered in 2011, it did not just create a local crisis, it turned the country into a massive, uncontrolled warehouse for military-grade hardware and extremist ideologies that have been flowing south into the Sahel for over a decade. Ibrahim Traoré often points out that the insecurity we face in West Africa today is a direct inheritance from the decisions made in Western capitals years ago. The weapons that killed our brothers and sisters in Burkina Faso often have serial numbers that can be traced back to the looted armories of the old Libyan state. This is why the suspicious end of Saif Al-Islam Gaddafi is such a critical event on the global chessboard. Saif was the only figure left who had the potential to close those gates of instability. He was the one leader who could have unified the warring tribes and restored a central authority that actually cared about African borders rather than foreign interests. By removing him, the planners of this tragedy have ensured that the southern highway of weapons and fighters remains open, keeping the Sahel in a state of permanent emergency. In Washington, the reaction to the massive crowds at the funeral on February 6th has been one of deep anxiety. For years, the United States has tried to manage Africa through a series of military outposts and surgical drone strikes, a strategy orchestrated by AFRICOM. But they are realizing that military force cannot stop an idea whose time has come. The fear in the halls of the Pentagon is not about a single man named Saif. It is about the domino effect of sovereignty. If Libya were to become truly independent again, the entire Western military architecture in the region would lose its justification. The US dollar, which thrives on the instability of others to maintain its status as a safe haven, would find itself pushed out of a region that is increasingly looking for alternatives. This brings us to the shifting alliances that have left Western diplomats confused and frustrated. While the West relies on sanctions and lectures about democracy, other players have entered the field with a different approach. Russia has positioned itself as a security partner that doesn't come with the baggage of colonial history. Ibrahim Traoré has been very clear that he prefers partners who provide results over those who provide empty promises. The presence of Russian strategic advisors in the region is a direct response to the failure of Western interventions. They are filling the vacuum left by the collapse of the old order. Meanwhile, China is watching from the sidelines, ready to build the infrastructure of a new Libya once the dust settles, trading concrete and steel for the resources that the West once took by force. Traore sees this as a great game where African lives are often treated as pawns, but he is changing the rules. He is building the alliance of Sahel states, a new bloc that refuses to take orders from Paris or Washington. The death of Saif al-Islam was intended to be a warning to this alliance, a sign that the old powers can still reach out and touch anyone they choose. But instead of retreating, Traore is using this moment to consolidate his vision. He knows that the only way to stop the flow of blood in the Sahel is to have a stable, sovereign partner in the north. The strategic map is being redrawn, not by foreign mapmakers, but by the feet of the thousands who marched in Libya and the resolve of the soldiers who stand guard in the Sahel. We must also consider the role of the Mediterranean as a strategic barrier. For decades, Europe has looked at Libya as a buffer zone to prevent the movement of people from the south. By keeping Libya fragmented, they thought they could control the flow of humanity. But they forgot that a broken state cannot be a border. The tragedy of February 3rd has shown that the policy of controlled chaos has failed. The consequences are now reaching the shores of Italy and the streets of France. Ibrahim Traoré is warning that you cannot have a secure Europe while you are actively destabilizing Africa. It is a lesson in strategic blowback that the West is learning the hard way. Looking ahead, the question remains, what happens to the map now that the heir to the Gaddafi vision is gone? The vacuum created in Zintan will either be filled by a new generation of African nationalists inspired by Traore, or it will be filled by more of the same mercenary forces that have plagued the land for 15 years. Washington is currently scrambling to find a new figurehead, someone they can control, someone who will keep the oil flowing and the dollar dominant. But the people in the streets of Bani Walid have already made their choice. They did not gather for a puppet. They gathered for a memory of dignity. Ibrahim Traoré is telling the world that the era of managing Africa like a colonial plantation is over. The strategic map is no longer a one-way street of extraction. It is becoming a network of resistance. From the gold mines of Burkina Faso to the oil fields of Libya, the message is the same. We know the price of our freedom, and we are no longer willing to pay it in silence. This is the Van Colon, the grand chess match of our time. And as the pieces move, the world is beginning to see that the real power does not lie in the hands of those who hold the weapons, but in the hearts of those who hold the truth. There is a common mistake made in the high offices of London and Washington when they look at the continent of Africa. They believe they are still dealing with the same generation of leaders who were trained in their universities and conditioned to seek their approval. But as Ibrahim Traoré frequently points out, a massive shift has occurred beneath the surface of the soil. The funeral of Saif Al-Islam Gaddafi on February 6, 2026, provided a vivid window into this new reality. If you look at the footage of the thousands who gathered in the mountains of Libya, you do not see only the elders who remember the glory days of the 1970s. You see the faces of the young. You see a generation that was born into the smoke of 2011 and grew up in the ruins of a state that was dismantled before they could even vote. These young people are not fueled by nostalgia. They are fueled by a hunger for a future that actually belongs to them. For decades, the West has exported a specific model of democracy to Africa. They told us that as long as we had elections every 4 or 5 years, we were on the path to progress. But the youth of today are asking a much harder question. What is the value of a ballot if the people we elect have no power to protect our borders? What is the value of a vote if the price of our bread is decided in a boardroom in New York? This is the educational core of the New Africa movement. Ibrahim Traoré has become a global symbol for this generation because he speaks the language of results rather than the language of procedures. He has taught the youth that true justice is not a signature on a piece of paper in a foreign capital. True justice is the ability to walk down your own street without fear. It is the ability for a nation to own its gold and its oil without asking for permission. The young people in the diaspora, those living in the heart of the West, are playing a crucial role in this awakening. They are the ones who see the contradiction every day. They live in cities where the infrastructure is built on the wealth extracted from their homelands, and they are using the tools of the digital age to bridge the gap. When news of the suspicious death of Saif Al-Islam on February 3rd reached social media, it didn't take weeks for the truth to spread. It took seconds. The official narratives of a natural death were dismantled in real time by young Africans who have learned to read between the lines of global propaganda. They understand that when a leader who represents sovereignty is suddenly removed, it is a direct attack on their own aspirations. This generation is choosing a path of pragmatic nationalism. They are looking at the models of the past not as blueprints to be copied, but as lessons to be learned. They saw how the dream of a gold dinar was crushed in 2011, and instead of giving up, they are asking how to build it stronger this time. They are looking at the US dollar, and they are seeing a system that is losing its grip on the world. To a young person in Burkina Faso or Libya, the dominance of the dollar is not an abstract economic theory. It is the reason their parents' savings have lost value, and the reason their countries are trapped in endless debt. Ibrahim Traoré has tapped into this realization. He has shown them that the choice is no longer between East and West, but between dependency and dignity. The West often wonders why African youth are turning away from traditional alliances. The answer is simple. They are turning toward themselves. They are tired of being told that they are a continent of the future while they are treated like a museum of the past. When they saw the massive crowds for Saif al-Islam, they didn't see a return to an old regime. They saw a collective demand for a system that actually works. They are rejecting a version of democracy that has become synonymous with dysfunction and corruption. They want a state that protects, a state that delivers, and a state that respects its own people. If a leader like Traoré provides that, they will stand with him against any external pressure. This is the great nightmare for the planners of the global status quo. You can sanction a government, you can freeze assets in a central bank, and as we saw in Zintan, you can even remove a key political figure from the board. But you cannot sanction 1 billion young people who have decided that they are no longer afraid. The fear that once kept Africa in a state of submission is evaporating. In its place is a cold, calculated awareness of how the world really works. The youth are realizing that the instability in Libya and the Sahel is not an accident of history, but a design of policy. And once you see the design, you can begin to dismantle it. Ibrahim Traoré's message to this generation is one of agency. He tells them that no one is coming to save them. And that is actually their greatest strength. Because when you realize that no one is coming to save you, you realize that no one has the right to tell you what to do. The choice made by the youth in the streets of Libya is a signal to the entire world. They are choosing a new Africa that is defined by its own borders, its own currencies, and its own heroes. They are choosing to stand with those who speak the truth, even when that truth is dangerous. The death of Saif Al-Islam may have been intended to silence a legacy, but it has only served to sharpen the resolve of those who will inherit the continent. The events surrounding February 3rd, 2026, have set a countdown in motion that many in Western capitals are trying to ignore. But history has a brutal way of collecting its debts. Ibrahim Traoré has warned that when you bury the truth under a mountain of medical reports and diplomatic silence, you're not solving a problem. You are planting the seeds of a much larger explosion. The price of this failure to provide transparency regarding Saif al-Islam, Gaddafi's final moments, will be paid in the currency of trust, and for the West. That account is already nearly empty. If the world continues to treat the death of African leaders as minor footnotes in a global game, the reaction will not be another decade of submission. It will be a total recalibration of how Africa engages with the rest of the planet. We are looking at a future where the traditional tools of Western influence, such as sanctions and conditional aid, will no longer carry any weight. Ibrahim Traoré has already demonstrated in the Sahel that when you push a nation into a corner, it does not just stay there. It finds new partners. The price of failing to respect African sovereignty in Libya will be the permanent loss of the Mediterranean buffer. As trust evaporates, the cooperation required to manage migration, energy security, and regional stability will vanish with it. Washington may believe that removing a potential nationalist leader simplifies the board, but they are actually creating a chaotic landscape that they can no longer navigate with their old maps. The reaction from other global powers is already telling. Moscow and Beijing do not need to launch propaganda campaigns when the actions of the West provide all the evidence needed. Every time a suspicious event like the one in Zintan occurs, it reinforces the narrative that the West is a partner of the past, while the East is a partner of the future. The price of this failure will be a Libya that turns its back on the dollar and its face toward the BRICS alliance. This is not just a political shift, it is an economic earthquake. Imagine a world where the massive oil reserves of Libya and the gold of the Sahel are traded in a system that bypasses Western banks entirely. That is the future being built right now by the frustration and anger of those who stood in the dust at the funeral on February 6th. Furthermore, we must consider the price of internal collapse. If the people of Libya conclude that their path to a peaceful, sovereign election has been sabotaged by external interests, they will not return to the ballot box. They will return to the streets. The vacuum left by Saif al-Islam will be filled by a much more radicalized and uncompromising spirit of resistance. This is the danger that Traore is highlighting. You cannot suppress a nation's desire for dignity forever. When the people lose faith in the possibility of a political solution, they begin to look for a revolutionary one. This leads to the kind of instability that cannot be managed by drone strikes or special forces. It leads to a generational fire that burns through borders and alliances. The strategic failure here is the belief that Africa is still a place where outcomes can be managed from afar. Ibrahim Traoré is the living proof that this era is over. He is telling the world that if you choose to operate in the shadows, you will eventually be blinded by the light of the truth. The price of the current strategy is the total irrelevance of Western diplomacy on the continent. Within the next few years, we will likely see the formation of a unified African security architecture that explicitly excludes those who have spent decades destabilizing the region. This is the recalibration that is coming. It is a future where the West is not the director of the play, but merely a spectator in the audience. Ultimately, the greatest price will be paid by the global financial system. The US dollar depends on the belief that the current world order is stable and permanent. But when a leader like Traore questions the very foundations of that order, and when the people of a resource-rich nation like Libya show that they have had enough of foreign management, the cracks begin to show. The assassination of a dream is much harder than the assassination of a man. By silencing the son of Gaddafi, they have inadvertently awakened the spirit of millions. The cost of this one event on February 3rd will be measured in the loss of decades of influence and the rise of a new Africa that no longer seeks a seat at your table, because it is busy building its own. As the sun sets over the mountains of Zintan and the dust finally settles in the streets of Bani Walid, we must realize that we are not just witnessing the end of a man's life. We are witnessing the birth of a new level of African consciousness. The events of February 3rd and February 6th, 2026, will be remembered not as a moment of defeat, but as the day the veil was permanently lifted. Ibrahim Traoré has shown us that while they can target the body of a leader, they can never reach the soul of a nation that has decided to be free. The suspicious silence of the world regarding the end of the Gaddafi lineage is a testimony to their fear, not their power. They fear your memory, they fear your unity, and most of all, they fear a new Africa that no longer seeks validation from its oppressors. To my brothers and sisters across the diaspora and throughout the continent, our journey does not end with a funeral. It begins with a commitment. Ibrahim Traoré stands as a guardian of our collective hope, but he cannot carry this burden alone. We must be the voices that repeat the truth when the world tries to drown it out. We must be the ones who teach our children that their heritage is one of sovereignty and strength, not dependency and debt. The ghost of the old financial order is trembling because it knows that its time is running out. The US dollar may still hold the markets, but it no longer holds our minds. We have reached a turning point where silence is no longer an option. If you believe that Africa deserves to breathe its own air and control its own destiny, then you are part of this movement. We do not just ask for likes and shares today. We ask for a testament of your presence. We ask you to join us in a ritual of solidarity that transcends borders and oceans. If your heart beats for the freedom of the Sahel, if you stand with Ibrahim Traoré in the pursuit of justice, and if you believe that the truth about Libya will eventually set us all free, I invite you to perform a simple act of faith. Go to the comments right now and type Amen or I stand with Africa. Let these words flood the digital world like a prayer for our ancestors and a promise to our children. Let the powers that be see that our spirit has no borders and our resolve has no end. Subscribe to stay connected to the truth and share this message with one person who needs to wake up today. The rise of a new Africa is no longer a dream, it is our reality. May the spirits of our fallen heroes guide us, and may the truth always be our shield. Africa rise!
Subscribe to Voice of Sovereign Africa today. Let's build a greater Africa together.